so much. Wow. The last presentation, by the way, can we just say, was like fantastic. I do not know how to follow that. So I will let you know that this is going to be 1,000 foot, but I will not have as deep a sort of cut of like references and history. What I want to talk about today is a little bit abstracted from the NPC conversation, but I think is very related to the conversation around what we do when we inevitably have thousands or millions of agents operating in the world, potentially having like their own incomes, their own kind of funding, and when those fundamentally end up running a lot of the social world, both in real life and in digital games. So how many people here actually, like, I assume most people here grew up playing games of some kind, right? Like, who hasn't played a game, maybe, is like the better question, right? Okay, everyone. Who here is like in Web3 tangentially as a concept? Okay, cool. You also don't have to affiliate with that concept. It's kind of dead, so don't worry about that. And then 3, who here writes code, especially open source code, has like worked on, built open source code? Cool, awesome, a decent number of people. So to me, a lot of what we're talking about in all these spaces is coordination, and a lot of you have played MMORPGs know that most of that is about coordination as well. And I liked the theme of networked society so much that I sort of decided to focus in on that, partly because this idea of coordination in the context of open source is largely what I know, and so I didn't want to stray too far from what I'm already familiar with here. And so to start, I think that like we've built a lot of cool things as a civilization. I think we should keep building cool things. We built everything from like aqueducts to like woodblock printing, which actually preceded the printing press by like 700 years, and of course like the internet. But the thing that I actually want to talk about is the fact that as we've increased the pace of technological progress, we haven't really adapted social systems to actually make this any better. And generally speaking, I think in a lot of ways, our ability to make social progress has gotten worse. So generally speaking, as groups coordinate and grow, we hit this Dunbar's number threshold, and then people naturally are unable to really coordinate with each other very effectively. And we had things like kingdoms at one point that sort of fixed that, and then we were like, that's not very good, let's try and create states. And now we sort of had this general concept of networks, and networks are things like, you know, the internet and so forth that we're using today. They're also things that are accelerating themselves. So like the concept of networks and the way that we're using them is essentially growing as the type of infrastructure that we have is growing. And this abstraction is kind of like a further layer of abstraction on top of things like the state, which was already sort of its own abstraction from our peer-to-peer ways of relating to each other. So I think that we're kind of in this progression from things like speech, which like we're all familiar with, we're using here, to the internet, to things like, you know, Ethereum and so forth, and now to things like agents, LLMs, and so forth in such a wide capacity. I think this evolution is so wide that basically we have no real way to actually deal with this. So what I mean by that is in a network society, we still have maintainers of the actual code, of the LLMs, of the processes we're using, and increasingly those maintainers and increasingly the actual like people using those systems, none of those things are going to be people. There's tons of non-human agents. That's the whole sort of point of today. And I think as we increasingly see more of these agents, we have to ask the question, where is all the actual value that's being created from those agents going? And so that's the fundamental question that I think I want to plant the seed of here today, and for people to think about as they're creating things that are essentially in the autonomous sort of world's general circle. And ultimately, we have lots of software companies, we have lots of developers, we have lots of value generated, but generally maintainers have a lot of burnout, and generally they're not very well paid in most cases. And the reason this matters for this group and for people that are building autonomous sort of systems is that you have this sort of widening gap of productivity and hourly compensation. And as Peter Turchin talks about in a recent book, End Times, which I would recommend versus the talk, there's actually a huge problem with this, which is that you get into these cycles of revolution and counter-revolution that sort of in an S-curve, you know, successive fashion lead to more and more societal instability and then restability. And the problem with that is we're probably entering a period of increasing instability rather than increasing stability. And if we're going to build systems that are fundamentally based on autonomous agents, then I unironically think that things like Web3 can potentially fix the problem of how we actually distribute value back to creators of those systems. And I think this is sort of the fundamental question for a lot of people when we talk about like building digital worlds or like, the ownership of those digital worlds is how do we actually get that value to flow back in an equitable fashion so that we don't run into this kind of constant cycle of societal potential collapse. And I think that like we need to think about this essentially as soon as possible. I'm not going to be fully AI doomer on it. I think like the realistic possibility is that this is going to be a slow evolution of various types of AI systems. But I do think that it's a conversation that we're not really seriously having in terms of the actual ways of modeling those flows and how to actually start to implement those into the worlds that we're creating, whether those are game worlds or whether those are just online sort of networked platforms. So there's a post that Vitalik has on this topic, which is sort of about network subsidies in short. And what he talks about is essentially this idea of a revenue evil curve. And in my view, the thing that we sort of need to figure out is what are the things that are going to be necessarily sort of non-human agent centric, and how can we flow value from those things and then back to people in a way that is sort of in a form of networked flows of value? And how do we do that in a way so that the majority of things that are created, whether by non-human agents or by humans, are creating positive externalities, just meaning that like they're creating good in the world in some tangible metric-based way that is not specifically related to the core group that is building the tool, but related to an external third-party group, such as like a general city or a general society at large. And if we build these network flows, we can actually kind of create more of what I would call sort of like bundle economics or like solidarity economies between groups. And so if we can create this between, for example, online worlds, or for example, through digital platforms, or even between agents in some hypothetical sort of like virtual game world and agents, i.e. even humans in the real world, then I think we can actually sort of be more likely to avoid that civilizational collapse problem that I was presenting mostly from Peter Turchin through his book End Times. And these flows are actually very well known in a lot of communities, even those in, there's a lot of mutual aid sort of groups in New York, a lot of sort of similar groups here. I think the sort of flow of creation all the way through to like where surplus goes is not like necessarily a new concept, but I do think it's something that is not well explored in the Web3 sort of NPC autonomous world space to the extent that it is explored in even traditional MMORPGs. So EVE Online, for example, is a very robust game economy, which actually has an accountant, like a whole economist team actually on staff to start thinking about how does value flow back through players. Similarly, Neopets, which actually had a sort of Web3 stint, had this huge problem of value being essentially collected through their fake stock market essentially into the hands of a very small group. And now that they're trying to sort of revive this game, there's this huge problem of, well, wait, what is the incentive for people to actually keep playing this over time? And these are just in the like games themselves, but what I'm sort of trying to emphasize is that this is actually happening in the real world too. And if we can think of ways to flow the value between these worlds as we start to slowly spend more time in these digital spaces, I think that's really worthwhile to do. And I think these types of bundled economics are the way to sort of build those systems. Again, at a 10,000 foot view, I do not have any actual economics or papers to reference here, unlike the previous speaker, and I would like to talk to him about this afterwards. So essentially, this is not a new concept, as I mentioned. This is essentially a form of mutualism, and there's three principles to this concept. The first is sort of solidarity between a group, so a common vision and purpose combined with sort of mutual aid and support for the group. There's the sort of sustainability aspect. How do you actually have an economic engine? What is that engine, and how does it actually continuously generate value? You can't just have magic money that grows forever. You need some actual like reason that people want it. Don't think that's probably new to people here. And then you need some form of self-management. That group has to actually be able to do this relatively autonomously in a slightly different sense in order to continuously build up this sort of system locally, and then ideally create these positive externalities across many different versions of these networked groups. And this is essentially what at the very bottom here is being shown. It's kind of like the concept of functional polycentrism. So like essentially how do you have networked flows between different nodes? And this is actually how a lot of commons-based movements start and evolve. And in agricultural society, especially like in farmlands, this is a very common practice. And I actually think Ethereum kind of fulfills some of these characteristics on its own. And so I just want to use it as an example, as a grounding point, because I think people here kind of understand this concept already. But Ethereum has these credible commitments, which produce a secure shared state, global sort of ledger, et cetera. You have the ability to then exchange value on this sort of global ledger. People create things like games and DAOs and so forth on top of this tooling. And what's great about this, and what we've seen even with Gitcoin sort of and other projects that have sort of spawned in the last 5 years, has been the fact that people are willing to give value back down the stack. And they're willing to do it because they know that if they give value back to core maintainers, back to other, say, players in a game context, that they're going to benefit because the underlying currency, in this case ETH or other forms of currency in games like EVE Online and so forth, are actually gaining value because people are going back and reinvesting, even though that thing that they're investing in specifically is not flowing value back to them. It's a benefit to the overall commons, is actually giving value back to them. And that, to me, is sort of where decentralized organizations, sort of autonomous worlds, those sorts of systems should play a role. Folks here can correct me after if I'm wrong. I don't see a lot of that conversation necessarily happening quite yet. So there's sort of 3 main paradigm shifts that I'd like to sort of see people take away from this. And this is, again, wrapped into the context of Peter Turchin's work and others. But I think we should start to think about moving from this sort of object model, where we're thinking about like individual agents as objects and sort of individual games as spaces, to a networked model where we're viewing sort of the collective agency of these groups working together in tandem, towards sort of this model of entanglements, i.e. like how do we actually model those flows? And then, of course, to commoning, and this sort of model of these groups collectively and continuously sustaining this work over time based on some actual sort of economic engine. And this is, again, very abstract. It may be things people here already know, but to me, this is a really important piece of the puzzle that I see sort of coming on the horizon that is not quite in active discussion yet. So I'd love to take questions on this and generally just like start a conversation after this as well. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the network state concept is interesting. Like, to me, it's still an island sort of concept. It's very much like we're going to have these separate, individual objects, and these groups will coordinate, but we're not thinking of them as like part of a shared substrate. I think that you sort of see, I don't know, like the current model they say in the US. The US has states kind of coordinate together, and they also have this shared substrate, which is like the federal government and so forth that coordinates this. That system is pretty bad in lots of ways, right? I think people would probably agree. But like also, like they do have some way of actually, arranging to work with each other. They have some sovereignty, but it's sort of some of it is delegated out. So I think what you want is a more composable version of that, where in online worlds, there's like not only interoperability, but also like shared value flows between worlds that might share even a common currency, let's say. So like, I think the ability for something like EVE Online or something like World of Warcraft, when that was still popular for folks, that was one I played probably way too much. That to me would be much more interesting because you can start to think about like the actual flows between those game worlds, and the currency can start to be modeled and sort of managed, even in a traditional economic sense, using some of the same principles, rather than sort of like having to go through these crazy cycles of like games constantly dying and then new games popping up, and then like this sort of shifts happening kind of over and over again. I would love to see a way for like a broader continuation of worlds. And I think that's a part of like autonomy that has been talked about in Web3 and in the gaming context, but like I haven't seen any good like implementations of quite yet. I would imagine that like the group that I'm most bullish on for this right now is like the 0xPark community, for thinking about these concepts, and I know Brian is very pro sort of like thinking about these sort of like more mutualist systems. But going back down to the networks again, I'm kind of bouncing between the digital versions of these and the physical like actual state version of these because I see them as probably like merging in some sense. But in my view, that the network state problem is the same as that one.
In a lot of these games, the economy is controlled by a central authority. How do you reconcile that with the lack of control that we would have in the Web3 world over the currency that we deal with?
So I think in Ethereum, you have, I mean, some centralization, right? There's the whole, like, there's a huge conversation about this with validators and Lido and so forth right now. I think, generally speaking, you at least have, let's say in an ideal world with Ethereum, a decentralized base layer currency, which people are contributing to, and which is generally able to share value between its participants. That is owned by many companies, many of whom are building on this shared substrate of Ethereum, but it is not owned by any one of them. And that to me is like, it's an idealized model of Ethereum has not gotten there, in my opinion. But like, it's the closest thing I can think of that's applied that sort of concept. Beyond maybe if you go back to like the EU model and like, or like the US model in the context of states. In game worlds, I think that like, there isn't really an example of this that comes to mind because yeah, every game is created so far largely by a centralized company, even if that's like an indie dev, like a smaller organization. There's no real incentive for them to share that value between different games. Like it would actually be like totally, probably like a violation of their fiduciary duty as like an organization. And the only way to fix that is probably to not build a game, but build like a set of tooling that actually is facilitating that work rather than building, an individual game with an individual currency.
Yeah. So on that point, the game company design side, I think there's such an interesting question that becomes truly implemented and playable, right? So even within Pokemon and its own, series, they already are facing this problem of like, okay, we have to represent Pikachu from like the first version of the game, and we also have to represent like 8 generations later and manage all of these systems getting like attacks out of the hand. To go like they're facing that like incentive. So then to go to like true interoperability, I have a role to like if someone wants to bring an asset from over here and that needs to get rendered in one system, we would optimize it completely different way. Like I just feel like I've thought about this specifically for a while. I feel like it breaks down so fast when it comes to like actual playability. And then what I just come back to is just like Roblox. Like Roblox is the only real example of this. And what's a great example? Value capture is still fucking Roblox. Yeah. And it gets distributed out to developers, but you see what
I think that's absolutely, yeah. Like the ability to, like, there are reasons that game companies do not do this. And like, that's like that infinite Pikachu problem is like very much like, I don't know how you actually really resolve that part of it. I think that's where the problem is like in a lot of the, previous era of these conversations where people were like, let's make assets that are, tradable, like, collectible across games and so forth. I think the assets are so unique to the game that it's very difficult for me to imagine how that would work. Currencies, on the other hand, the only problem you have to worry about is like in each of these pockets, in each of these games, what is the actual distribution of these currencies and how are they actually like, because maybe in one game you have like one person that just like accumulated all the currency. Now suddenly they go into the next game, right? There's this huge problem. So you need each of these games to actually agree on a shared economic policy around those kinds of outcomes because otherwise like you can't do that cross currency aspect. But I think the currency is easier than the assets because, yeah. Yeah, I kind of used objects here, but that's maybe like has multiple meanings. Exactly. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And that's an important distinction. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but I think that's a really good point. And like, again, I think Roblox is also a good example of this, I think. And that would actually be a really cool case. Would be like, I don't want to just say like decentralized Roblox because like I feel like that starts to be like a very, now we're talking about 2021, there was a market for that maybe, but now it's like, but I do think that like, there's similar concepts that should be tried for sure.
I feel like a cross and somewhere in between the spectrum of like kind of what you're talking about, or at least implying around like fully decentralized and like long-standing like IP throughout many games, and that breaking down so quickly. Like the middle ground of that seems to be when I think of games like the new Mortal Kombat that has like a lot of almost like cousin IP systems that get like implemented into the game. And I think of kind of more examples like Fortnite that have like playable, characters from totally like different worlds that somehow have found like common ground that like you could call that a sort of like relationship that becomes less of like totally networked in every interoperable sense, but it's like more like I see you, you see me, this fits in our world, and like that can be like a continuation of like you lift me up, I lift you up, this IP works together. Like, do you think that there's a sustainable middle ground that feels like almost like custom IPs continuing to like find other family members, if you will?
I mean, I certainly think that like that's something that should like exist. Like, and I think like I'm not very much like I think I've probably over the period of time I've been in the whole like crypto space, I've gone from more idealist to more pragmatic as I've gone, and I'm still very on the idealist side. But like I think that like the idea of being able to slowly, incrementally show that these kinds of models of kind of management of assets works, even in that context, is a great starting point. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.